everyone. So we're going to be continuing this week with the philosophy of time, and we're going to be looking at influential positions in the metaphysics of time. So specifically at the debate between so-called eternalists, presentists, and growing universe theorists. So this is a debate about what exists in time. And then the debate, on the other hand, between the A theorists and the B theorists, who can be considered to be two approaches to responding to McTaggart's argument that time is unreal. Okay, so I'll switch to the slides. So presentism and eternalism, so, as I said, presentism, eternalism, we'll also consider the growing universe theory, views about what exists in time. So, specifically, the eternalist, I'll start with the presentist. The presentist says that only those objects, events, and times that are temporally present, so only the present time and whatever objects and events are located at the present time, exists. So that's all that exists, just the present exists. So things like the Big Bang, William Shakespeare, the American Civil War, the year 2030, and so on don't exist. So past and future times and events don't exist. Eternalism, as the name suggests, is the metaphysical view that the past and future, as well as the present, exists, and also whatever inhabits the past and future exists, just like whatever inhabits the present exists. So all those things that I just mentioned now, the Big Bang, the American Civil War, the year 2030, and so on, all of those things do exist according to the eternalist. So the eternalist thinks of reality as four-dimensional. So it has temporal extent as well as spatial extent, whereas the presentist thinks of reality as three-dimensional. So it just has spatial extent. There's only one instant of time that exists. So the eternalist is sometimes characterized as believing in a block universe, a four-dimensional space-time structure. Now, there's a sort of compromise view between these positions, namely what's known as the growing universe theory. So the growing universe theorist says that the past and present exists, but the future doesn't exist. So it's a sort of halfway house between the presentist and the eternalist. And the idea is that the growing universe theory is supposed to capture the intuition that what is past is settled and fixed, and what is future is open and unsettled. So the growing universe theorist captures this via an ontological distinction. So the past is settled in virtue of existing, whereas the future is open in virtue of not existing. Notice that this is the only one of the three theories that gives an asymmetry between past and future, at least an ontological asymmetry between past and future. The presentist says that neither exist. The eternalist says that both exist. The growing universe theorist is the only one that says one but not the other exists, namely the past exists and the future doesn't. Now, I suppose logically, is a logical possibility that someone could be a shrinking universe theorist, so they could think that the future exists but the past doesn't exist. But I don't know of anyone who holds this view, and I think the reason's fairly obvious, that it would sort of correspond to a view in which the future's settled but the past is open, and that would be probably contrary to common sense. Okay, so the growing universe theory, again, they think of reality as four-dimensional, but they think of it as increasing in size as more things come into existence, with the present being the growing edge of the universe. Okay, so sort of schematically, you could think of the sort of picture on the left as representing presentism. So just an instant of time exists. So just if you're like a cross section, a temporal cross section of what the eternalist thinks exists. For the growing universe theorists, so the blue squares representing the present, they would think of the universe as growing, the blue square representing the growing edge, the present, the growing edge of the universe. And the eternalist thinks that everything exists, so the past, present, and future all exist alike. Okay, so why would we hold one of these views over the others? Well, we've already given some initial motivation for the growing universe theory, that it provides a sense in which the past is closed and settled, whereas the future is open and unsettled, which corresponds to our intuitive view of the past and future. Presentism, many people take that to be the common, a sort of an intuitive view too. I mean, I guess it's arguable whether it's more or less intuitive than the growing universe theory, but I suppose presentists will appeal to the idea that it seems to us that there's something special about the present. So that we have direct epistemic access to the present. The past is merely remembered. The future is merely predicted. And so it seems to us that there's something special about the present, that which we directly experience. And so maybe the presentists can do justice to that by saying that the present exists, and the past and future don't. They also have an argument against eternalism, but one that also applies to the growing universe theory, which is that it sounds very odd to speak of past objects as existing. So it would sound odd to say that dinosaurs exist. It'd be so strange if someone came up to the street, came up to you in the street and said dinosaurs exist. Probably you'd think what they're saying is false. I guess likewise, to say something like Queen Elizabeth II's great great grandchildren exist would likewise seem a strange thing to say, arguably false. The growing universe theorist, with the presentist, denies that they exist, but the eternalist is committed to their existence. So dinosaurs exist, paraphrasable as there are some dinosaurs. Queen Elizabeth II's great great grandchildren exist, paraphrasable as there are some great great grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II. Both of those claims, on the face of it, sound wrong. So this arguably speaks in favour of the presentist position. Now, the eternalist has a response to this and says the reason it sounds odd to say that dinosaurs exist has to do with quantifier restriction. So consider an analogy. Suppose that my wife and I are driving in a car park looking for a parking space. The car park's very busy. Suppose that she's driving and I'm the passenger, and I say there is a parking space. Okay. So if I say there is a parking space, well, perhaps we carry on driving for a bit longer. My wife can't see a parking space anywhere. She said, look, but you said there's a parking space, a free parking space, I should say. And suppose that I reply, well, yeah, there's a free parking space, not in this car park, but surely there's one somewhere in the world. Well, I think sort of my wife would be justified in being annoyed with me because she interprets my claim there is a free parking space as saying not that there's some free parking space in the universe, but as saying there's some free parking space within the car park. So what I'm doing is I'm making an existentially quantified claim. I'm saying there is something, there is a free parking space. Um, and the normal interpretation of this quantificational claim, the claim that something exists, namely a free parking space, is as a restricted one. So my wife's interpretation is the natural interpretation. So she understands my domain of quantification, if you like, as objects in the car park we're currently in. So she understands my claim as saying there is one of these things, a free parking space, within this domain, within the domain of the car park. Now, I've been unhelpful in that actually I intended my claim to be quantifying over a broader domain of discourse, namely everything in the universe, and I was saying that there is a free parking space in the universe. But that's my intention. My intended domain of quantification was not the natural one to interpret me as quantifying over. Now, so the eternalist can. So what goes on is basically quantify claims like there exists such and such are naturally made relative to a domain of discourse, and that domain of discourse might depend on the context, right? So if we're driving around a parking lot and I say there's a free parking space, it's very natural to interpret me as quantifying over things in this parking lot rather than things in the whole universe. So what the eternalist is going to say is that when I say there are some dinosaurs, something similar is going on. So it's natural to interpret me as making a claim about a restricted domain of discourse, namely the present. So it's natural for you to understand me as saying that there are some dinosaurs in the present. There exist some dinosaurs, just like when I said there is a free parking space, it was natural for my wife to interpret me as saying there is a free parking space in this car park. And that's why it sounds weird to say that there are some dinosaurs, because there aren't any dinosaurs in the present. But what the eternalist will say is that when we lift the domain restrictions, so we're talking about the universe as a whole, what exists in the universe as a whole, then it's true that there are some dinosaurs. It's just that they're in a remote part of remote part of time, so way in the distant past. So likewise, we can lift the contextually determined restriction on my claim about parking spaces and see that there's an interpretation in which that's true. So it's true that there are some parking spaces in the universe. So the eternalist will say, well, look, they're talking about what exists implicita, what exists in an unrestricted sense, and in an unrestricted sense, dinosaurs exist. Just like in an unrestricted sense, free parking spaces exist, even if I happen to be in a busy car park. Okay, so they'll try to explain away the apparent weirdness of that claim in that way. Okay. Now, the eternalists might also go on the offensive and point out that there are fairly natural contexts in which we do seem to quantify over non-present times or non-present objects. So, for instance, if I say there's a first moment in time, or for every event there's some later event, there I seem to be or the natural interpretation of what I'm doing is quantifying over non-present times. So if I say there's a first moment in time, well, the eternalist can make sense of, a first moment that's distant past, right? So what I say when I say there's a first moment in time is an interesting claim, one we might discuss. For the presentist, if I say there's a first moment in time, then given that there's only one time for the presentist, well, yes, I guess there is only a first moment in time, and also a last moment in time, maybe, namely the present, which is the only time that exists. But that's not what I seem to be, that what my claim seems to be about, or not the natural reading of my claims. So the eternalists will point out that, we can and do often want to quantify over non-present times or objects or events, and that's perfectly natural. And the best way of making sense of what we're trying to say in those contexts is to admit that non-present times or objects or events exist. Okay, so more by way of evaluation. So the growing universe theory. Let's focus for a minute on the growing universe theory. So so we saw that it has some kind of initial attractions in distinguishing the past from the future, in treating the past as settled and the future as open. What are there any criticisms of it? Well, yes. So one criticism is that you might think, well, if the universe is growing, as the growing universe theory says it is, then it seems there must be some rate at which it's growing. So whenever we talk about a process, it seems to make sense to talk about the rate at which that process occurs, how fast it occurs. So you might think, well, the growth of the universe is a process, so surely it makes sense to talk about how fast that occurs, or the rate at which it occurs. Now, the problem is that it seems very difficult for the growing universe theorists to give any sensible answer to that question. So all their answers are going to seem sort of silly or nonsensical or vacuous. So they might say, well, an hour per hour, the universe is growing at a rate of an hour, or maybe like 1 trillion objects an hour. These seem like sort of at least slightly puzzling answers. And insofar as they're sort of puzzling, they seem silly or vacuous, then you might wonder whether we can really make sense of the growth of the universe at all, right? If we can't give a sensible answer about the rate. So now an hour per hour, I suppose the hour per hour answer is the one that seems vacuous, right? So it seems tautological, and we might have qualms about it for that reason. 1 trillion objects per hour doesn't seem, or however many objects come into existence per hour, it doesn't seem vacuous, and I guess it doesn't seem that silly either. But maybe there's another worry about it. So it seems that we're sort of presupposing time in order to talk about our rate. So we're saying 1 trillion objects per hour, as though we already have a notion of what an hour is. So maybe that's an okay answer, but it does seem to presuppose time, and so it seems to forego what might have seen an advantage of the growing universe theory, namely the thought that maybe we could analyze what it is for time to pass in terms of the growth of the universe itself, right? So we might think that the passage of time just corresponds to the rate of growth of the universe. But then if we have to appeal to the passage of time in order to make sense of the rate of growth of the universe, then it looks like we'd be going in a circle. So we'd be saying 1 trillion objects per hour, as though we already have an antecedently given notion of an hour beyond the rate of growth of the universe. Okay, so there are some worries about growing universe theory. Are there worries about presentism? Well, I mean, we looked at one earlier. Sometimes it does seem natural to quantify over non-present objects, and sometimes it seems that we speak truly when we do so. Related to this is a worry about making sense of some other claims that seem to be true that we might make. So suppose I say Biden's election victory caused him to be US president. That seems like a very uncontroversial claim. It seems pretty obviously true. Maybe Trump would dispute his election victory, but most of us wouldn't. But now if you're a presentist, then it seems that Biden's election victory doesn't exist. So I guess you agree with Trump in that respect. Because his election victory is in the past, it doesn't exist, right? So that's not Trump's reason, obviously, but the presentist seems to have an independent reason for thinking that Biden's election victory doesn't exist, namely that it was past. So, but then the question is, well, if it doesn't exist, then how could it cause something that does exist, right? So his presidency does exist because it's in the present, but how can something that doesn't exist cause something that does exist? That seems a puzzle. And if it can't, then the claim that the very straightforward and seemingly obviously true claim, Biden's election victory caused him to be US president, looks like it might be false on presentism. And so we might, for that reason, worry about whether presentism can be a reasonable metaphysical theory. So there's this sort of problem of causation, right? So when we talk about the causes of present events, presumably those causes occurred in the past. So according to the presentists, they don't exist. And then we might worry that, well, stuff that doesn't exist can't cause stuff that does exist. And so it might look like present events are uncaused after all, which seems problematic. There's another problem or worry about presentism related to reference. So it seems that I can refer to non-present entities. So like, for instance, William Shakespeare. So if I say Shakespeare was a playwright, then this seems a sensible claim. It seems to be a true claim about a person, William Shakespeare, who existed in the past. And I seem to be correctly attributing to William Shakespeare the property of being a playwright. So most people would take this to be uncontroversially true. Now, the problem for the presentist is, how can I refer to something, namely Shakespeare, who doesn't exist? So the presentist says Shakespeare doesn't exist because he's past. And so the question is, how can I sensibly talk about Shakespeare, as I seem to be able to do? How can you refer to something that doesn't exist? So again, this is a sort of argument that if presentism were true, on the hypothesis of presentism, fairly straightforward claims that normally everyone would agree are true become problematic or maybe false. And you might think that a metaphysical theory that renders problematic or false vast tracts of ordinary language claims is not an attractive metaphysical theory. You might think, well, why not go for a metaphysical theory that can do justice to our ordinary language claims, as arguably maybe eternalism can. Now, the presentist is normally going to want to try to resist these criticisms. So they might say, for instance, okay, yeah, I can't, because Shakespeare doesn't exist, we can't refer to Shakespeare. But they might give some other semantics for the sentence Shakespeare was a playwright. They might, in other words, try to explain how that can be true even though Shakespeare doesn't exist. So the question then is, well, what is it that makes Shakespeare was a playwright true if Shakespeare doesn't exist? It seems that it's got to be something in the present that makes it true. So if I say Shakespeare was a playwright, that seems true. If I say Shakespeare was a sailor, that seems false. The past doesn't exist, so Shakespeare doesn't exist, and Shakespeare's state of being a playwright doesn't exist, nor does Shakespeare's state of being a sailor exist. But yet it sounds better if I say Shakespeare was a playwright than Shakespeare was a sailor. So what is it in the present that grounds the truth of Shakespeare as a playwright, and grounds maybe the falsity of Shakespeare as a sailor? Now, maybe there are things that the presentists can say here. So, for instance, they might say, well, look, there are historical records of Shakespeare's being a playwright, and those are sufficient to guarantee that there was this person, Shakespeare, who was a playwright. And that's what makes the claim true. So then the question is, are there always states of affairs in the present that are sufficient to guarantee that the past was as it was, and that can therefore ground the truth of the past tense claims that we want to be true? Another issue for presentism, and arguably this is a problem, well, I think this is just as much a problem for the growing universe theory as it is for presentism, is that they seem to be arguably in tension with the special theory of relativity. So you don't need to worry about the technical details here. But in the context of special relativity, there's no absolute simultaneity. So simultaneity is relative to a frame of reference, or in other words, to a velocity. Well, okay, so what does that mean? Well, the present is taken by almost everyone, I think, maybe everyone, to be a set of points that are simultaneous with one another. So we normally think that each part of the present is simultaneous with every other part of the present. But if what's simultaneous is going to be relative to a velocity, then what counts as present is going to be relative to a velocity. So specifically, according to, it seems that according to special relativity, events that I regard as present are not necessarily going to correspond to those events that you regard as present if we're traveling at different velocities. So some of the events that I'll regard as present will lie in what you regard as the past, or what you regard as the future. Now, this seems to pose a problem for the presentist. So the presentist says that what's present exists, but it looks like in special relativity, what's present depends upon one's frame of reference. But it's sort of kind of difficult to stomach the idea that what exists is somehow relative to a frame of reference, relative to a velocity. And most people would feel uncomfortable with that sort of relativized view of reality. Now, so that is sort of a worry. There's also a sort of second worry, maybe related, which is that, well, the reason we kind of thought that the present was special was probably because not just individually, me, myself, regards the present as special, right? So it's not just that I have a direct epistemic access to a certain set of events that I regard as present, and that makes me infer that there's something objectively privileged about the present, but rather it also had something to do with the intersubjective agreement there was about what was present. So we wouldn't, just because we have an experience doesn't necessarily incline us to infer that that experience is of something objective, right? So for instance, if I dream about something, I have a dream experience, I'm not very inclined to infer that that corresponds to something objectively existing. And part of the reason is because no one else has the same experience as me when I dream, right? Whereas there are things that we do have in common in terms of our experiences. So there's intersubjective agreement about some things, and that might incline us to think that those things are objective. So maybe the external world might be something like that. There seems to be a lot of agreement about what the external world is like that's intersubjective. Maybe that provides us with a reason for inferring its objectivity. Now, so you might think, well, so what inclines us to think that the present is ontologically privileged? There's an objective present that's somehow metaphysically special. Is that not just there appears to be a set of events that's special for me or for you, but that actually kind of we tend to agree. We tend to agree on which events are present, and that maybe makes us infer that the present is something ontologically privileged. But now it looks actually in special relativity like our agreement is very contingent. Agreement is contingent on the fact that we're traveling at similar velocities. So it just happens to be true that most human beings, almost all of them, are traveling at very similar velocities, in the sense that our velocities relative to one another are very small fractions of the speed of light. Were it to become the norm that we travelled at much greater velocities relative to the speed of light, so for instance, if it became common for us to travel backwards and forwards to Mars in spaceships, then there would be a lot more disagreement about what's present, corresponding to the relativity of the present in special relativity theory. And then we'd lose that in subjective agreement, and therefore we might be less inclined to think that there's something ontologically special about the present. So the suggestion here is that it's just a coincidence of the fact that we don't travel very fast relative to the speed of light, that there's intersubjective agreement about what's present. This is very contingent. So maybe actually this intersubjective agreement doesn't give us good reason to believe it in a metaphysically privileged present after all. So this seems to be a worry for both the presentist and the growing universe theorist, who both think that there's something metaphysically privileged about the present. The presentist, of course, thinks that the present is all that exists, whereas the growing universe theorist thinks that it's special in the sense that it's the growing edge of the universe. Okay, so I suppose the advantages of the advantage of presentism. I mean, the sort of main advantage that was originally claimed for presentism is it's sort of harmonized with a common sense picture of the world. Maybe the growing universe theorists could argue that actually their view better harmonizes with a common sense picture because it distinguishes past and future in a way that presentism doesn't. But then there are various ways we've seen in which the eternalists can push back against this claimed advantage of the presentist and of maybe the growing universe theorist. Okay, so now we'll just park that debate for a moment while we discuss the debate between the A theory and the B theory of time. So this debate is not the same as the debate between the presentist and the eternalist, as we'll see, but we'll come back to how it relates to the presentism eternalism debate. So the presentism eternalism debate is a debate about what exists in time, whereas the A theory and the B theory isn't in that way an ontological debate. It's not a debate about exactly what exists in time, but still is a debate about the nature of time, a metaphysical debate about the nature of time. But we'll come back, as I say, to how they interrelate. So the A theorists and the B theorists, we can sort of relate these both to McTaggart. So obviously McTaggart, as we saw last week, distinguishes the A series and the B series, which in turn are grounded in the A properties and the B relations. Now, both the A theorists and the B theorists reject McTaggart's claim that time is unreal. However, the A theorists reject McTaggart's conclusion for a different reason from the B theorists. The A theorists think that what McTaggart got wrong was his insistence that the A series is contradictory. So the A theorists believe that, in fact, the A series exists, it's not contradictory, and they might agree with McTaggart that the A series is necessary for time. They just deny that it's contradictory, and they claim that it does indeed exist. The B theorists, on the other hand, also reject McTaggart's claim that time doesn't exist or isn't real. However, they share with McTaggart the view that the A series is problematic and doesn't exist. However, unlike McTaggart, they think that the B series is enough for time, all in its own. Okay, so let's look in a bit more detail on these theories. So the A theorists hold the following metaphysical theses. So they think there are A properties, pastness, presentness, futureness. These are irreducible. They can't be reduced to B relations or something like that. And they think that the passage of time is real. So the passage of time, so the idea is that, we have this subjective experience of time passing or flowing. The A theorist says that this subjective experience corresponds to something objective, an objective passage of time, the changing of the present. This, it might be that our experience isn't perfect, doesn't perfectly correspond to the objective reality, but at least it tracks it to a reasonable degree. They also hold a semantic thesis, so-called non-reductionism about tense. So tense sentences are understood in terms of irreducibly tensed facts. So, we'll come back to it. But I mean, for instance, if I say dinosaurs existed as opposed to dinosaurs exist, that's past tense sentence, and it's to be understood in terms of the tensed fact that the past tense fact that dinosaurs existed in the past. So if you like that dinosaurs have the property of being past. Another example, so consider Joe Biden is now president of the USA. They're going to say that's true because Biden's presidency has the property of presentness, so it's present tensed, and the thing that makes it true is the fact that the state it's talking about, namely Biden's presidency, has this property of presentness, an A property. If I say the past tense sentence, Donald Trump was president of the United States, well, that's going to be true because Trump's presidency has the property of pastness. Likewise, if I say AOC will be president of the United States, future tense sentence, well, that's going to be true if AOC is president in the future, and that will be because her presidency has the property of futureness, again an A property. So B theorists are different, obviously. They hold that there are no A properties, or at least no irreducible A properties. There are only the B relations. They're all that's fundamental. But they think that the B relations suffice for time. And in contrast to the A theorists' non-reductionism about tense, the B theorists are reductionists, so they think that tense sentences can be understood in terms of tenseless facts. We'll come back to that point about tense in a minute. So the B theorist, if you recall that McTaggart thought that the A series was necessary for change because he thought, well, the B relations are permanent and so don't give you change, whereas the A properties change. So what was future becomes present and then becomes past. Well, actually, the B theorists reject the idea that the B relations aren't enough for change. So they would just say that change just involves the obtaining of tenseless B theoretic facts. So, for instance, it's a tenseless fact that Donald Trump is president on January the 19th, 2021. Or, if you like, January 19th, 2021 is during Donald Trump's presidency. That's a tenseless B fact. On the other hand, it's also a tenseless B fact that Joe Biden is president on January the 20th, 2021. Or in other words, January 20th, 2021 is during Joe Biden's presidency. So a tenseless B fact. Now, what the B theorists will say is that the obtaining of these tenseless facts is what it is for the presidential incumbent to change. So the presidential incumbent changing, in this case, just is for it to be that, well, one day Trump is president and the next day Biden is president. So change just consists in these tenseless facts. Now, when it comes to tensed sentences, so sentences that talk about what was, what will be, what is, where is understood as saying something about the present, well, they say, yeah, these can be true, but we don't need to invoke A properties in order to understand how these can be true. So they'll point out that these sentences presuppose a position or a vantage point in time. So normally the position is the time of when these sentences are uttered. So, for instance, I might say Joe Biden is now the president of the United States. Donald Trump was the president of the United States. AOC will be the president of the United States. These are all tense sentences. The B theorist is going to try to understand how these are true in terms of B relations alone without invoking A properties. Now, what they say is that the truth value of these tense sentences depends upon the time at which they're asserted. So, to use a technical term, they're indexicals. If I say Joe Biden is now the president of the United States, well, that's true if and only if I assert that sentence during Biden's presidency. So this relation of being during is just a tenseless B relation. So note the difference with the A theorist semantics. So they'll say that that sentence is true if and only if Biden's presidency has the A property of being present. The B theorist is denying this. It's saying there's no such A property, or at least no such irreducible A property. They're just saying, well, the sentence is true not because Biden's presidency has some special property, just because of the B fact that my assertion of the sentence is during Biden's presidency. Likewise, if I say Trump was president of the United States, well, that's not. So the A theorist would say, well, what makes that true is that Trump's presidency has this special A property of being passed. Well, the B theorist denies that. They say actually there's no need for a special property of pastness. Rather, that sentence is just going to be true because of a relation, a B relation, that my utterance of the sentence stands into Trump's presidency, namely the fact that Trump's presidency is earlier than a B relation, earlier than the utterance, my utterance of the sentence. Likewise, when it comes to the claim that AOC will be the president of the United States, so the A theorist would say that's made true, if it is true, by AOC's president having a property of futureness. Again, the B theorist says, well, no such property is needed. We just need to appeal to a B relation between the time of utterance of the sentence and the state of affairs that it's about, namely the earlier than relation, so or later than. When I say AOC will be president, that's true if and only if the state of AOC's presidency is later than a B relation than the time at which the sentence is asserted. Okay, so finally, and I guess this is a complex slide, so but it's kind of, I think, helpful to think about it in terms of a table or a grid. You might sort of be interested in, well, what's the relationship between these two debates that we've been considering? So on the one hand, the A theory, B theory debate. On the other hand, the Presentism Eternalism growing universe debate. Well, these are, they're not the same debate, right? So the Presentism Eternalism growing universe debate is about what exists. In terms of past, present, and future, which of these exists? The A theory, B theory debate is more a debate about the passage of time, and so according to the A theorist, there's objective passage. According to the B theorist, it looks like there's no objective passage. There's just the B relations. So you might sort of naturally wonder, well, can we just adopt any combination? If we think about these two debates, can we just adopt any combination of views? So can we combine the A theory with anything we like, with presentism, eternalism, the growing universe theory? And can we do likewise if we're B theorists? Are we constrained by our position in one debate as to our position in the other debate? Well, to some extent, yes, actually, it looks like. So it seems that the A theory, in fact, can be combined with any of the three positions on the ontology of time. The B theory, well, we might wonder about that. So I'll come back to the B theory. Think about the A theory first. Well, it might, and I guess this is why I hesitate to say that the B theory is compatible with any of these views. So the presentism and the growing universe theory sort of look like atheoretical views in the sense that they say that there's something special about the present, and they give a sense in which time flows, right? So for the presentist, the present is obviously special by being the only thing that exists, and time flows in the sense that what exists changes, so we get an objective flow of time. So these look like features that lend themselves to an A theory. For the growing universe theory, well, the present is special in a different way. It's not the only thing that exists because the past also exists, but it's special in that it's the growing edge of time. And again, not only is it special, but is the present special in this view, but also we get a kind of flow of time that's understood in terms of the growth of the universe. And so again, the growing universe theory gives us two of the key features that atheorists are committed to. So I think, it's reasonable to wonder whether what one could really talk about oneself as a B theorist if one were either a presentist or a growing universe theorist. Now, on the other hand, so the B theorists certainly can be an eternalist, and most, if not all, B theorists are eternalists. But it doesn't go the other way, right? So just because you're a eternalist doesn't mean you have to be a B theorist. So you could think that past and future exist, but you could think that there are genuine A properties, right? So you could think that there's something actually objectively special about the present. There's a genuine property of presentness, just as it's not just a matter of perspective. So the time of utterance of a sentence, for instance. But there's a special property of presentness. There's maybe special properties of pastness and futureness too. So the combination of eternalism and the A theory is sometimes called the moving spotlight theory. So on this view, reality is, as the eternalist says, a four-dimensional manifold. But there's a slice of that manifold, a time slice, if you like, that's metaphysically privileged, and which slice is privileged changes. So the metaphor is of a spotlight moving across four-dimensional space-time, successively illuminating the special part of it that's present. So that's certainly a possible view. Okay. So what are the sorts of advantages and disadvantages of combining the views in various ways? Well, suppose you're an A theorist and a presentist. Well, those views seem to sort of nicely sort of go together, as I've said. And you can do justice obviously to the sort of flow of time, the passage of time, but you're going to suffer from these objections from special relativity. So you think that the present is somehow special, maybe special in terms of existence because you're a presentist, but the worry is that what's present is frame relative, relative to velocity, and you might be I guess we might be disinclined to think that what's real is relativized to a velocity. Also, I mean, obviously, you've ditched the past and the future in terms of existence, so actually nothing has these A properties of pastness and futureness. The only things that exist are present things, and so really actually it sort of looks like you've narrowed yourself down to one of the A properties, namely presentness, and the only things that have A properties are things that have the property of presentness. So whether that's a problem or not, I guess is an open question. What about the moving spotlight theory? Well, I suppose that it might seem like a nice combination because you can make you're not rejecting the existence of past and future entities. So, for instance, you have a ready way of making sense of claims about Shakespeare because, according to this view, Shakespeare exists. But you also have, if you want the attraction of being able to do some sort of justice to the notion that time passes, and that's in virtue of your being an A theorist. So you have change, even though you have but not just the present existing, but also the past and the future. So maybe that's a reasonably attractive combination of views. But I mean, there are some objections. So you might think, well, firstly, we've got a sort of this question of rate. So given that it's a version of the A theory, so you might say, well, how fast does time pass? How fast does the moving spotlight move? And the question is whether we can give any sensible answer to that question. You might also think, well, if you're going to say that the past and the future exists, then why bother being an atheist? You might say, well, we can already, given that the past and the future exists, we can give a reductive account of past and future tense sentences in terms of the earlier than and later than relations, because the whole manifold exists. There are things that stand in these earlier than and later than relations. It's not the case that everything that exists is simultaneous with one another. So you might think, well, it just looks like, and it looks unnecessary to add this further ontological primitive of the privileged present or the moving spotlight. Then I guess I won't go through all of these. You can there's 6 combinations. You can sort of reflect on the advantages and disadvantages yourself. So yeah, I mean, I suppose another interesting combination to think about is the B theory and eternalism. So this is a sort of major combination in the sense that a lot of B theorists are eternalists, and vice versa. So you I guess gain some of the advantages of having past objects exist. So you can deal with all these claims about past events causing present events, and deal with the issues surrounding reference to past objects and events. But on the other hand, you might worry that this account doesn't really do justice to our experience of the passage of time, right? So you might say, well, that there's no sort of ontological flow in the sense that the present is neither all that exists nor at the growing edge of the universe, because this is an eternalist view. And nor do we have any special property of presentness that only certain objects have, as on the moving spotlight view. So you might think, well, all we have is the permanent B relations, and so where does our experience of the passage of time come from? It's not obvious that the combination of B theory with eternalism has the resources to account for our experience of passage. Now, you might think that experience of passage is an illusion, like with Taggart, or you might have some other account of why we have that experience of passage. But certainly that's a challenge for the view. Okay. All right. So we'll leave it there. So some interesting things to reflect upon in terms of what the most attractive of these combinations is. Various of them seem to have virtues, but there are drawbacks associated too. But it's sort of interesting to reflect upon, firstly, whether each combination in turn is tenable, and secondly, which might be the most attractive in thinking of our overall metaphysics of time. That's where we'll leave it for this week, however. And next week, we're going to be talking about a closely related topic, again on the direction, again on time, philosophy of time. But in this case, we're going to be thinking about the direction of time, which is certainly not unrelated to these questions about the A theory and the B theory. Because, for instance, you might think that, well, something like the A theory gives us a direction of time because it gives us a changing present. But maybe there are other accounts of the direction of time, and it might be that the B theorists can appeal to some of those. Maybe this will go some way towards helping them account for our experience of time. But that's something we'll look at next week. Hope you all have a good week, and I will talk to you again then. Okay, bye.